Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Subversive Approaches. I'm a research professor working with the Central Asia program at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. So welcome, everyone, to the Central Asia program seminars. We're going to address today an important, sensitive topic that is preventing violent extremism. Sensitive because the extent of the risk of violent extremism in Central Asia remains debated, actually, and second, because the methods to deal with, to address violent extremism remain also widely discussed. The questions of preventing violent extremism, I mean, how it should be addressed is often at the crossroads of sometimes common, sometimes different, or even contradictory views, contradictory approaches, contradictory practices emanating from different actors with, on the one hand, local stakeholders, and on the other hand, external actors, including international organizations. So to address these difficult questions, we're very lucky and very happy to have today a real specialist on this topic, Dr. Chiara Pierrebonne, who has done a lot of research on that, including a major field study. So Chiara is going today to focus on the EU efforts, the European Union efforts to prevent violent extremism by engaging civil society in Kyrgyzstan. So Chiara Pierrebonne is currently a senior lecturer at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek, so in Kyrgyzstan. She received a PhD, a binational PhD in sociology and social research from the University of Bielefeld in Germany and from the University of Trento in Italy. Chiara works on many topics, including the EU support to civil society in Central Asia. She works, of course, on preventing violent extremism and also on sustainable development and local ownership, social capital, and resilience. Chiara published many papers, many articles, including in peer-reviewed journals, such as Central Asian Affairs, Central Asian Survey, Development Policy Review, and she's been the author or contributor of edited volume in the past years. And she also served as a manager of education and research exchange programs in Europe and Russia, funded by the European Commission and the DAAD, and of collaborative research projects in Central Asia funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. One more point before we start. This seminar is actually part of a civil society initiative that we have at the Central Asia program at George Washington University. So this initiative has several goals, including the diversity, including addressing, the diversity of civil society actors, I mean, their objectives and their modes of engagement. We also want to investigate how the Central Asian governments approach civil society and its organizations, and also to explore the narratives and roles of foreign actors in the development of civil society in Central Asia, and assess their potential influence in the region through the civil society organizations. And you can find more information actually on this initiative on our Central Asia program website in the initiative section. So after Chiara's presentation, we will have a Q&A session with the audience. So please feel free to send your questions in the chat box. So thank you so much, Chiara, for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
So Sebastian, thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to contribute to the Central Asian program and to its civil society initiative. I really hope that through my presentation today, I will somehow contribute to your endeavor of bringing Central Asia to the world. As you mentioned, the presentation today will be focused on the EU efforts of preventing violent extremism in Kyrgyzstan. through the engagement of civil society. And I would like to stress that this project was actually the last study of a bigger postdoctoral, here in Germany, we would say habilitation project that was focused on my habilitation project that was focused on EU support of civil society in Central Asia, looking at Kyrgyzstan and at Kazakhstan, and looking at three different programs, three different instruments that the EU has at its disposal to provide financial support to civil society organizations on the ground. These three programs are the instrument contributing to stability and peace, the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, and the thematic program non-state actors and local authorities in development. My presentation today will be focused on one specific program, the Instrument Contributing to Stability and Peace, that has been implemented between 2014 and 2020 worldwide. This instrument per se is not new. Actually, in 2014, it replaced the previous instrument for stability. And this is an instrument which is pretty generous, since it provides 3.5 billion euro for the period 2014 and 2020 for activities in three different fields. The first field of activities funded by the instrument contributing to stability and peace is a short-term response to situation of crisis or emerging crisis to prevent conflict under Article 3 of the instrument. Article 4 and Article 5 of the instrument provide financial support to civil society organizations for more long-term actions in the field of conflict prevention, peace building, and crisis preparedness, in the case of Article 4, and for addressing global and transregional threats and emerging threats under Article 5. So the presentation today will take into account all the projects that have been implemented between 2017 and 2022. The fieldwork, the main fieldwork was conducted in 2019. Overall, 9 projects were implemented in Kyrgyzstan under the instrument contributing to stability and peace in the past years, with an overall budget exceeding 12.7 million euros, so a very huge budget. These projects were national projects, were regional projects in 2 cases, and were binational projects, or even projects implemented in 3 countries in the case of 2 projects. What was particularly striking when I came to Kyrgyzstan in February, or when I arrived to Bishkek in February 2019, is that I discovered that all the projects implemented under the instrument contributing to stability and peace had some sort of PVE component. They were somehow related to the prevention of violent extremism. This was for me somehow surprising. This phenomenon characterized also the project implemented in the second, let's say, generation. So all the 9 projects implemented between 2017 and 2022 had some sort of PV component, either in the title, in the project descriptions, in the description of the objectives, or even in the keywords used when these projects were advertised on the webpage of the EU delegation in Kyrgyzstan. The instrument contributing to stability and peace also financed a special program called STRIVE. STRIVE stands for Strengthening Resilience to Violence and Extremism. This is a global program implemented by the Dias Center, which was awarded 5 million euro for supporting local partners in designing, developing, and implementing initiatives against radicalization and recruitment to terrorism. Overall, 4 main types of activities were conducted in this framework: capacity building, civil society empowerment, media professionalization, and research. And the idea of the program STRIVE was to work with local communities to create conditions conducive to development and resilience toward violent extremism. Now again, what was very striking for me in 2019 is to see how the instrument contributing to stability and peace all of a sudden has became an instrument for providing initiatives or for offering projects, for conducting projects that were aimed at preventing violent extremism. I was somehow surprised because my previous fieldwork in Kyrgyzstan never revealed a centrality of the VE, so violent extremism, and the centrality of the PVE topic for Kyrgyz civil society and society at large. I was somehow surprised. I remember the previous fieldwork that I conducted was in 2017, and now going back also to the introduction of Sebastian and the civil society initiative hosted at his university. Well, in 2017, I had many discussions with civil society activists, with civil society organizations that were talking about, that were reflecting about, that were considering new forms of civil societies that were developing at the time in Kyrgyzstan with a more religious component. So the international donor community was seeing new forms of more religious, let's say, oriented civil society initiatives that seemed to be very relevant for the communities on the ground, but that the international donor community itself didn't really know how to deal with. So in 2017, I had a lot of discussion about what is religious civil society in Kyrgyzstan, what is the main function of religious civil society in Kyrgyzstan, and how can the international donor community relate to this type of civil society. Well, in 2019, February 2019, the topic has significantly changed, I would say, at the entire civil society sector, activists, international donor communities, CSOs on the ground. They were all talking about VE and PVE. And I somehow found myself all of a sudden in the so-called PVE bubble. The reason for that is that as an answer, as a reaction to the UN Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism, which was launched in 2016, several projects, more than 35 projects, were implemented by international donor community with the help of their civil society partner in Kyrgyzstan. Again, between 2016 and 2020, more than 35 projects conducted in Kyrgyzstan had a PVE component. And this was a huge amount of project, and I would say this is also a huge amount of budget that was invested in this field. A budget of around, this was estimated by myself, so the budget was around 42 million euro. Why? Why was the international donor community operating in this field? As I was saying, the UN Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism has made PVE a global priority, and at the same time, by making PVE a global priority, the plan has also introduced a new approach in dealing with PVE, an approach that foresees systematic preventive measures that are not just aimed at countering the phenomenon of violent extremism, but also at preventing the phenomenon of violent extremism by addressing main drivers. And this plan of action attributed a role of pivotal importance to civil society organizations as central actors that are able to reach the beneficiaries, that know populations at risk, and also that can play an important role in educating, in promoting tolerance, in promoting respect for life, in promoting practice of non-violence moderation, dialogue, and cooperation that were all identified as important elements to spread a culture of prevention, a culture that would not allow violent extremism to flourish anymore. The same, let's say, approach to violent extremism and radicalization has also characterized then the European Union, that in the strategy for Central Asia, launched in 2019, explicitly stated how violent extremism and radicalization and the issue of returning terrorist fighters, as experienced by Central Asia, are priorities for Central Asia and priority for the EU partnership with Central Asia. In the strategy, we could see how the EU somehow conceptualizes its engagement in this field. So in the strategy, it is really mentioned how the EU wants to enhance the exchange of good practices with Central Asia states and societies, including research on drivers of violent extremism, preventive measures, and counter messaging. These are all elements that are constitutive of its preventive strategy in the region. At the same time, a role of pivotal importance is attributed to resilience. So building resilience of a local community towards violent extremism. Once again, in line with the UN Action Plan on preventing violent extremism, that, as I was saying a couple of minutes ago, has significantly shaped not only, let's say, what the international donor were programming for Central Asia, but also what has been implemented by civil society organizations in the past years. This strategy of the EU, the strategy for Central Asia, also highlighted the importance of the use of whole of society approaches and the central role played by civil society as better place to address underlying conditions conducive to terrorism and violent extremism through consistent outreach to vulnerable populations. And I would say that the UN Action Plan on preventing violent extremism and this let's say, emphasis on preventing of violent extremism, characterizing the new EU strategy for Central Asia, are a very important element for understanding the framework of what I will be telling you in a couple of minutes. So, what I basically did in Kyrgyzstan in 2019 was really to meet with the different EU-funded organizations that received financial support by the EU under the instrument contributing to stability and peace and its program Strive. What I tried to do while I was analyzing the interviews was to figure out the different extents to which the different contribution that civil society played in the field of PVE. And overall, looking at specifically the EU-funded civil society in Kyrgyzstan, I identified 5 different functions, 5 different roles that civil society fulfilled on the ground in Kyrgyzstan. The first function was the development and delivery of capacity building seminars and trainings. The second function was the establishment of mechanisms of dialogue, consultation, and advocacy. The third function was research and research capacity building. The fourth function was the production and circulation of counter-narratives and alternative narratives. And the fifth function was the subgranting of smaller scale community-level projects. Now, let me make some examples. About the development and delivery of capacity building seminar and trainings, I can tell that different seminars, different activities were conducted and were addressed in this framework, addressed to youth, to women, to local CSOs, covering a variety of topics such as gender, conflict sensitivity and mediation, religious literacy, media literacy. For instance, in this framework, 100 women were trained in Bishkek and Jalalabad on women's rights, peace, and inter-ethnic and inter-religious tolerance. Then of these 100 women, 20 were selected for a second program that was focused explicitly on raising awareness about violent extremism, radicalization, to make them capacity builders in this field in their respective communities. Another example of activities conducted under the function 1 is the institutionalization of a non-discrimination curriculum in state training centers that took place with EU-funded organization cooperating with the Ministry of Interior, the National Security Agency, the Correctional Agency of Kyrgyzstan, and the Bar Association. And in this framework, a large-scale national training program was developed, and manuals for law enforcement agency and actors were created and distributed. Another EU-funded project provided capacity building activities for journalists focused on how to broadcast religion-related issues in a more neutral and conflict-sensitive way. With the help of experts from the Institute of Telecommunication and Technology and in close cooperation with the State Commission on Religious Affairs, another project implemented under Function 1 was succeeded in developing 2 web models on digital media literacy that were addressed at and adapted to 2 target groups, children and teenagers in schools and migrant workers, to enhance their digital skills and competencies. These are just some examples of activities, concrete activities conducted under Function 1. About the second function, the second form of engagement, the establishment of mechanisms for dialogue, consultation, and advocacy, I can say that the EU-funded organization created different types of platforms, different types of working groups, bringing together different stakeholders ranging from state official, experts, to representative of civil society, academia, religious group, representative of local authorities, and so on. For instance, at the local level, dialogue platforms were employed to facilitate the process in which people could come together, better understand each other's respective problem and each other's perspective and different interests. Overall, this platform enhanced the interaction within and between community and state authority, preparing the ground for new intergroup trust, once again, between state authorities and people at the local level. In addition, they provided a space for communities to monitor the effectiveness of local responses to local problems and to monitor the work, basically, of local authorities and keep them accountable. At the national level, similar mechanisms were used as intellectual instruments. This is what my interview partner said, at least, to promote regular dialogue on topics related to, for instance, religion and religious education. At the regional level, expert meetings were organized between law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, security agencies, and CSOs. During these expert meetings, so-called actionable responses were formulated and policy recommendations were given to be included in the Central Asia country's national strategy on PVE, providing a legal framework for civil society engagement in this field. Example of research and research capacity buildings that were carried out by EU-funded civil society organizations are the following. Studies were conducted on civic identity in Kyrgyzstan and the role of religion, on the role of religious leaders at local and community level, on the phenomenon of Islamophobia in Bishkek, We had a study on the factors and trends characterizing women radicalization, on judicial practices related to cases of extremism, terrorism, and on the role of civil society organizations in countering violent extremism. The fourth function, the production and circulation of counter-narratives and alternative narratives. I mean, this function was typical of the projects implemented, especially in the framework of STRIVE. One specific project in this field, for instance, foresaw the analysis of 100 propaganda videos that were analyzed by a team of experts in the field of terrorism, religion, psychology, and education. And based on the results of this analysis, 10 alternative storylines targeted at young people between 14 and 28 years of age were developed, and a video entitled "To Be Unified" was produced and made available on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and other social media. Last but not least, the function subgranting smaller scale and community level project. This was also a very important function, I would say, since the CSO engagement in the field of PVE could produce and reproduce itself. From a, let's say, theoretical viewpoint, we could see that the 5 function is where the entire scheme is repeated and can be repeated and reproduce itself. Projects were implemented to increase gender equality and to reflect on gender stereotypes affecting especially religious women. One project was specifically focused on increasing the participation of young people in local decision-making processes through their involvement in local crime prevention centers. I mean, there was a project, for instance, focused on rehabilitating the infrastructure and the facilities of the local crime prevention center. And another very important project, I would say, was aimed at raising awareness of the rights and anti-discrimination policy and procedures for vulnerable communities. And here we're talking especially about migrant communities living in the southern part of the countries. So what I tried to do with this scheme is to kind of present a short summary of 5 main functions that were fulfilled by EU-funded civil society organization engaged in the field of PVE. And this was supposed to be originally the main finding of my study. But then when I was reflecting on these different type of functions and the different kind of activities that were implemented in this framework, I kind of noticed that these activities and these functions relate to the PVE, so to the prevention of violent extremism, in different ways. And that's the reason why I came up with an additional distinction characterizing the PVE engagement of EU-funded civil society, distinguishing between PVE-specific activities, PVE-related activities, and PVE-relevant activities. So PVE-specific activities are those efforts, at least this is how I defined this kind of activity based on my data and based on my observation. So PVE-specific activities are those efforts that are addressed to individuals that are becoming or are already radicalized, or are activities that are addressed to violent extremist offenders that are engaged in de-radicalization, rehabilitation, and reintegration processes. A second kind of PVE activities are the PVE-related activities that are aimed at strengthening the resilience of individuals and communities by promoting, for instance, their social and economic empowerment. Then we have a third type of activity, the PVE-relevant activities, which are aimed more at systemic reform, by fostering good governance, rule of law, respect for human rights, and so on. Based on my observation, PV-specific activities are characterized more by an emphasis on security. The PV-related activities and the PV-relevant activities are characterized by an emphasis on development. Although this is not development in general, this is a development that is very much subordinated to some sort of security, let's say, objectives and goals. With regard to the activities implemented by EU-funded organizations, I can say that most of the activities that were carried out were PVE-relevant and PVE-related activities, and that only a small number of activities had a PVE-specific component. The second somehow striking thing that emerged from my analysis was the extensive use of so-called reappropriation processes. I called reappropriation the process of idea recipients' adjustment to the shape and content, or both, of foreign ideas to make them more congruent with the recipient's prior beliefs and practices. What I noticed basically was that while the projects had been implemented, going down, traveling down a chain of implementing organization and implementing stages, the interaction taking place and the practicing taking place allowed some sort of translation of these projects, of these, let's say, project informed by the global agenda of PVE in a way that fit the objectives and categories of the implemented organization on the ground. So some sort of localization was taking place there. Why? So it was for me very surprising because this was not the first time I was conducting research on the EU support of civil society, but these processes of reappropriation in the case of the PVE agenda were very evident and were very, very rich. So I did a little bit of literature review and I discovered this is not the first time that Kyrgyz civil society is reappropriating international programs and international projects, making them more relevant to their own agenda and to their own priorities. For instance, already in 2005, Patrick has described how local environmental and youth-oriented NGOs used donor-created spaces for activity that were molded to the target group's specificities and needs rather than to the donor's priority, even in the case of diverging purposes, which means that what they did on the ground, what these local environmental and youth-oriented NGOs did on the ground, sometimes were even in contradiction to or with the purposes of the aid givers. But what was important to this organization were actually the needs and specificities of their target groups. Similar observations were made also in other publications describing how Kyrgyz civil society works in a way that CSOs consider appropriate and feel fully justified in pursuing training and activities in a way that realize their organization's goal, not necessarily the donor's goal. Another observation that was made is that CSOs in Kyrgyzstan are able to use the available resources to realize what they see as their mission and see one of their roles to be translating their activities into a language that is acceptable to the donors. So it's not that the language of the donor is translated, not only that the language of the donor is translated in local language, but somehow that local priorities is translated in a language acceptable and maybe appealing to the donors. So this was very interesting, I would say, observation and I think a way of understanding why reappropriation were taking place. Reappropriation were taking place because Kyrgyz civil society has a very strong agency, is very experienced, and has been used in the past, I would say, 20 years to reappropriate global agenda and make it and translate it in a way that is relevant for itself as civil society and in some cases for local constituencies and local beneficiaries on the ground. The second reason, according to my literature review, why processes of reappropriation were so abundant in the field of PVE, the second reason comes from the strategic ambiguity characterizing the PVE agenda itself. That, as was noted by TSN already in 2019, and talking specifically about Kyrgyzstan, this agenda allows donors to build consensus and operational support with a diversity of partners and implemented partners that are able and are allowed to interpret and recase objectives according to self-interest. The reason is that the PV agenda per se is very blurred, is undefined somehow. We don't exactly know what extremism is, what violent extremism is, what radicalization is. There are different definitions at the state level and the international level. So this allows, and even the UN action plan itself is very comprehensive, identify drivers, identify push factors and pull factors, but we don't exactly know how all these factors relate to each other. And this allows this, let's say, confusion or not being completely clear about the interconnection between drivers, between push and pull factors. We're not so clear about the definitions, what is VE, what is PVE, makes processes of reappropriation more likely and easier, I would say. When I was analyzing my transcriptions, I figured out that there were 3 ways in which EU-funded organizations under the instrument contributing to stability and peace reappropriate the program. There were examples in my data of adaptation, of reinterpretation, and contestation. So adaptation takes place when external norms are reconstructed to fit with local beliefs and practices. Reinterpretation takes place when local actors borrow and frame external norms in ways that make them relevant for the local audience, but that they can also render them significantly different from the original meanings. Finally, contestation takes place when local actors question the utility and applicability of new norms, ideas, and paradigms, fearing that the latter might undermine existing beliefs and practices. Now I would like to provide you with some examples about this mechanism. So overall, I can see and I can say that there was very much skepticism with regard to the issue of VE, so the importance, the threat represented by violent extremism in Kyrgyzstan, as well as the relevance of the PVE agenda for Kyrgyzstan when I conducted my fieldwork in 2019. So a very good example of adaptation was provided by a Kyrgyzstani NGO, explaining how, especially in the framework of the program Strive, the organization was somehow socialized with the PVE framework. As highlighted by a representative of this organization, they were referring to the Hedaya staff, which was implementing Strive. So they actually provided us with the capacity building in PVE and CVE, countering violent extremism, and explained to us what PVE and CVE are. And they were very supportive in sharing knowledge. They developed the tools and shared them with us, taught us, and they sent us to other trainings so that the knowledge that the organization had in this field could be expanded. Clearly, in this quotation, we can see that the organization assigned to itself a passive role in determining the content, for instance, of this training program. At the same time, the organization also revealed that some forms of local ownership were actually possible in the framework of these PVE projects when the organization was implementing its own initiative on the ground. So they were very supportive of us, let's say creativity of doing what we can do best. So the organization, we were given freedom in deciding what to do, but it was always agree with them. They always asked us, what do you think is better? They did not impose anything by saying, you should do it like that. They asked, could you explain to us? And so we were explaining, and they admitted, oh, I see. And if the point was valid, they accepted. So we can see that there was a form of exchange. Something was given to this organization, something, knowledge was given to them, but they had the chance also to contribute to shape the project on the ground, at least in the implementation phase. What is also important to say is that many smaller NGOs that were provided financial support, especially under the program Strive, actually adjusted the previous agenda, so adapted the previous agenda to the changing funding environment. And so the new PVE agenda characterizing the international donor community as an opportunity to continue their work in promoting peace and stability among local communities by adding maybe a VE, a violent extremist component in their training program. So it was a very functional way of adapting to the agenda. The interviews also suggested that the processes of reappropriation took place not only in the implementation phase, but also in the design and writing of the projects. For instance, one organization highlighted how they really decided to apply for the call of the instrument contributing to stability and peace only when they had the certainty that this topic was relevant for the local context. Another example of reinterpretation comes from labeling mechanisms that were used by EU-funded organizations. Usually PVE initiatives, PVE projects were presented as such when EU-funded organizations were interacting with EU officials or with the international donor community in general. For instance, if there was a project official launching event, so you could see the title, you could see an emphasis on PVE, the PVE component. The same organizations then tended to use the label CVE, countering violent extremism, when they were interacting with state authorities at the local level. So for instance, when they requested permission to conduct specific activities on the ground, they preferred to use the CVE label, which is much more in line with the strategy and with the vision characterizing the Kyrgyz government, which is not talking about PVE, but rather about CVE. The reference to violent extremism disappeared when EU-funded organizations talked to local authorities and beneficiaries on the ground with whom they prefer to talk about peace-building activities. So the idea of using the peace-building label was justified as a way to avoid stigmatization and also to avoid the further spread of the phenomenon by familiarizing maybe new people with the issue of maybe people who didn't know about the existence of this phenomenon. At the same time, I do believe that this labeling mechanism was also an attempt to bring the initiatives that the EU-funded organizations were implementing under the instrument contributing to stability and peace, more in line, to bring them more in line with their own priorities and previous agenda. So this is very well testified by the second quotation reported on the slides, where one of the organizations highlighted that we are a peace building and conflict prevention organization all our activities are focused on applying different tools and instruments in order to prevent violent or non-peaceful conflict resolution. Through the project, we are not really targeting radicalization and terrorism, but contribute to the development of an environment through which radicalization can be prevented by applying different sorts of peace-building instruments. So we can see here that the organization is saying we are a peace-building and conflict prevention organization, and this is the framework in which we operate, also in the field of PVE. Besides adapting and reinterpreting the engagement in PVE to the international, national, and local context, EU-funded organization, but a smaller group of them, also exhibited a more subversive approach that was characterized by unofficial, non-confrontational forms of contestation. It was more, I would say, discursive resistance that emerged during the interview process I had with this organization. But of course, this discursive resistance had also some implication on the ground. For instance, one of the interviewed organizations pointed out how, as an organization, we are quite critical of PVE and CVE, and we call them CPVE, because essentially they are the same on the ground. And what we are doing through this project, I believe, is not preventing violent extremism. I don't see it that way. The same organization also pointed out the problems of the PVE agenda, which is an agenda that somehow is diverting funds from systemic challenges, such as structural injustice, long-term human security, fostering community development, and somehow was pushing the organization to either change the focus of their activities or to instrumentally add a PV component to their activities. As the interview partner observed, some organizations are changing and are actually doing a lot of work on this issue, PVE, and are displacing the focus on a range of fundamental issues, or they are working in fields that they used to work, be it democracy or education, but they have a violent extremism lens, and they are trying to justify this by saying, oh, look at all those results we have had. And this reinforces the whole cycle. And then people, donors, want to invest more money in this field. Now, here we are. I don't know how much time I still have.
Chiara, I'm so sorry. Could you try to wrap up in a few minutes now? Because, I mean, it's already 10:50 and we have some questions. So we'll need to just have something like 10-15 minutes for the Q&A. I'm so sorry.
Yes, no, there is no problem. So I wanted to conclude and sum up now just very briefly. I think what the presentation has showed us is that there are three different kinds of PVE activities that characterize EU-funded organizations operating in the PVE field. These activities are PVE specific, PVE related, and PVE relevant. And overall, we can see 5 different functions fulfilled by CSO, supported by the EU in the field of PVE. Capacity building, seminars and trainings. We have the establishment of mechanisms, dialogue, consultation, and advocacy. We have the conduction of research, the production and circulation of counter-narratives and alternative narratives, and the subgranting of smaller scale community-level projects. Processes of adaptation, reinterpretation, and contestation are useful to EU-funded organizations to exercise their own ownership, the real ownership, and also to further realize their own potential. However, if these processes remain undisclosed, there is a risk of perpetuation of inappropriate intervention. Just a short example about it. This labeling process and the implementation of so-called peace-building activities on the ground. These peace-building activities are actually watered-down activities that tends to be too unspecific to help radicalized individuals, and at the same time, not relevant for the rest of the communities living in at-risk villages. There is an issue there. So the second problem of these undisclosed processes of reappropriation is that we never get the real feedback of what is really happening on the ground. And I saw, for instance, that in target communities at risk were in the past 5-7 years, really millions of euro have been invested in increasing cognitive resilience of villagers there. I mean, these communities still lacks of essential infrastructures. There are no schools, no factories, no streets, in some cases no potable or irrigation water. It would be much more important, and I think a much more effective way to help these communities if a need assessment would be conducted to understand which are the local needs. Small investment could be made to address these local needs, which are local needs in terms of lack of access to resources that are also the causes, most of the time, the root causes of prolonged conflict in this region. And then what I also want to highlight is that these processes of reappropriation are typical of civil societies funded by the EU and also by other international donors, since they are even functional and necessary to make sure that the EU assistance on the ground is functioning. So the EU prefers to work with a limited number of organizations that the EU knows and that are capable of managing such huge grants. But of course, there is an issue there because the same organizations apply for different fundings. And at the end, they are forced also to reinterpret these funding programs in order to be able to conduct relevant projects and projects that they are really where they are competencies and they have skills. At the same time, CSOs on the ground also justify these reappropriation mechanisms, saying that this is a way for them to cope with a redundant and overlapping international donor agenda, which is very detached from realities on the ground. The very last observation that I want to share with you today is the need of making a transition between ownership and local ownership. It is good to know that we have to deal with a very mature civil society, a civil society which is not dependent on the donor anymore, at least from an ideological viewpoint. But I would say that the aim of all these programs supporting civil society is not to stimulate ownership, but is to stimulate local ownership. So my hope for the future is that CSOs will be more engaged as intermediaries, bridging aid givers and aid receivers and making sure that the voices of real people and the needs of real people on the ground are heard. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Chiara, for this very rich presentation, which shows, the complexity of the topic. So we have, a few minutes for questions. I've received many questions, actually. A question maybe, I think, which is important, is about terminology. When organizations and various stakeholders talk about preventing violent extremism, 2 points are often noted. The first one is a lack, actually, of a definition of what is violent extremism. And second, you have several words, several terms, for example, radicalization, extremism, or fundamentalism are often used interchangeably. And these terms have actually very different meanings. Radicalization does not mean necessarily violence. So 2 questions here. The first one, do the European programs on which you have worked give a specific definition of these terms, so of extremism? And second question, when shaping and implementing preventing violent extremism programs, is there any real discussions between foreign and local stakeholders about this terminology, about the meaning of these terms, as for, obvious reasons, it's essential to know exactly what they are going to talk about, what they're going to address, what they're going to work on.
So can I really answer?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for this question. Yes, there is indeed a lack of clear definitions, and the EU is not really providing definition with this regard. I mean, if we take a look at the strategies that the EU published with regard to its own security, counterterrorism strategy, and so on, you will find some definitions. But what the CSOs on the ground receive are call for proposals attached, for instance, to the instrument contributing to stability and peace that tends to be extremely vague. So these keywords that you were mentioning, radicalization, extremism, fundamentalism, are used as really keywords in the calls themselves, and as a result, the project tend also to repeat the same kind of formula and just put these terms. I mean, I was looking also at a description online available at the EU delegation webpage in Kyrgyzstan, a description of the last wave of projects funded in this framework, and you could see that the keywords were always radicalization, extremism, but the content of the project themselves were not, I mean, the content itself was not necessarily related to violent extremism and radicalization. And I think there are, of course, some communication channels between EU delegations and between, if I'm not mistaken, the instrument is even managed by an office in Vienna. So there are opportunities for exchange, especially when organizations are interested in applying for a call. But there are not opportunities for real discussions, I would say, about the terminologies. That's the reason why there is so much ambiguity when we are talking about the PV agenda, since there are no real, let's say, definitions and the concepts are not so clear, I would say.
Thank you. We have a question on the background of the actors of the PV program. So who were the trainers? What are their background, and how were the participants selected?
Yes, it is difficult to provide the comprehensive answer to this question because we're talking about 9 huge projects. So the projects tend to have a budget of around 1 million euros. So you can imagine how many trainings are implemented in this framework. What I saw is that on the ground, these projects are implemented by local organizations and by local trainers. They have their own mechanism for selecting participants. It depends on where they are operating. If it is a training in Bishkek, you have specific social networks you can use to advertise for it. If we're talking about a village, then you have other mechanisms for doing that. You can maybe really invite people, visiting them at home, or you can go to the local authorities and ask for addresses and information on the people living in the village, and then select with whom you want to do the training. So there are different strategies, since we are talking about different kind of trainings and programs taking place in Bishkek, in major cities, in the regions. But I want to highlight that these EU-funded organizations have local partners on the ground, which are conducting the training through local trainers. So everything is very much localized, I would say.
I mean, we have a question on the differences between regions inside Kyrgyzstan. Extremism and violent extremism can be, the risk of violent extremism can be different from one region to another in Kyrgyzstan. So to what extent is that taken into account in the PV programs of the European Union or beyond?
It depends on the kind of activities that they are conducting. Going back to my previous slide, so if we are talking about, for instance, PVE-specific activities, they tend to be conducted in so-called community at risk, where the state and the organizations are aware that there are individuals who radicalize, who are radicalizing, and so on. So usually you have, let's say, more PVE-specific activities in so-called communities at risk. And these communities, at least when I conducted my fieldwork, were situated especially in the southern part of the country at the border with Tajikistan and with Uzbekistan. PVE-related and PVE-relevant activities were implemented all over the country. As I was saying, the PVE agenda was implemented in a very broad way. It was not always PVE-specific activities that was carried out, and very often the training had a very general topic, and it was not necessarily a VE or something related to the phenomenon of violent extremism. It was more promotion of empowerment of women yeah, and then maybe, yes, many of the activities under Function 4, the production of counter-narratives, this is something that, for instance, happened in Bishkek mainly, where the experts were based, where they met, and they, it was a very interdisciplinary group of people working on these propaganda videos and coming up with narratives. So this was something that happened in the capital of Kyrgyzstan.
All right, maybe one or two more questions. I mean, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but another question is when it comes to foreign and international cooperation, one issue which is often mentioned is a lack of coordination between the foreign actors. So the question is, how the EU is coordinating with other actors, and with which actors actually it coordinates?
Yeah, so there is in Kyrgyzstan a special organization that is coordinating development cooperation, and I know that regular meetings are taking place, and I remember that at least when I was doing my fieldwork, the person in charge of the operational, let's say, section at EU delegation was also one of the coordinator of these donors council. And I remember that in this framework, meetings were taking place. But what I saw on the ground was a lack of coordination between donors that allowed also civil society organizations to basically implement the same project over and over, and to make this project funded by, they receive funding from different donors who were working on similar issues. Maybe the titles were changed, or the main objective was changed, but the substance was not changed. It was kind of replication of the same projects. And this is also something that was highlighted by my interview partners. It's this lack of coordination and a very redundant agenda, and an agenda that is also not really relevant due to a lack of somehow communication with the people on the ground, the realities on the ground. Yeah.
And maybe a last question. So your research focused on Kyrgyzstan. The question is, how's the experience of PV projects in other countries, including in Central Asian countries, taken into account, and to what extent actually that makes sense, considering the different political, historical, cultural, and social contexts?
Yes, so I think that Kyrgyzstan, if we look at the CSOs engagement in the PV field, is surely one of the countries where we can learn a lot, because as we know, Kyrgyzstan provides one of the most conducive environment for civil society activities in the region. So if you're interested in looking what is possible, you could surely look at engagement of CSOs in Kyrgyzstan and take inspiration from the different kind of activities and engagement that they show. At the same time, I would dare to say that Kyrgyzstan can learn from other Central Asian countries what they are doing with regard to repatriation, especially the experience of Uzbekistan and the engagement of civil society in the repatriation project could be taken into account as example by the Kyrgyz government, also in the new framework, a new counter-terrorist framework, new plan of action that will be probably approved this year and enter into force next year, I think the plan should take into account the potential of civil society in reintegrating and rehabilitating foreign fighters, women and children that were in Iraq and in Syria in the past years.
Okay, one very last question, if we can, Chiara. So the extent of the risk of violent extremism in Central Asia, remains debated, going from analysis saying that the risk is pretty high to papers arguing that not only violent extremism, but even radicalization in Central Asia is a myth. For example, like the paper which was published a few years ago by David Montgomery and John Heather-Shaw. So based on your research and conversations with local stakeholders, how is this risk viewed in Kyrgyzstan? Do you feel any evolution of how these risks are viewed by the civil society and all the local stakeholders you talked with?
Yes, it depends really on the organizations I interviewed. I could say that international donors, local and national implementing partners of international donors tend to be instrumental in dealing with this topic and saying that there is an issue of VE and PVE just to justify their engagement in this field. If you talk maybe with activists that are not necessarily related to organizations receiving international funding, you will get a milder position, moderate position. When I was in Kyrgyzstan in 2019, they were saying this is not an issue for us. And we see that real issues, systemic issues are not being taken into account anymore because the money are now spent, or the money is, let's say, diverted towards this issue, the PVE agenda. At the same time, we must also say that 850 people, Kyrgyz citizens, have left the country in the past. This is the reality, plus their wives and children. And these people will also need at one point, or will be interested to come back to Kyrgyzstan. So this is, I would say, a real issue. And generally speaking, you just need one terrorist to make an attack. So I think the issue is always relevant, and 850 citizens is not a small number. So I wouldn't underestimate the threat. But at the same time, I wouldn't securitize the development agenda and make everything a topic of prevention of violent extremism. There are other areas that also need to be taken care of, and development per se also needs to become, or to be a new priority, or become priority again, detached from the VE issue and the PVE issue. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Chiara. Unfortunately, we really need to conclude now. There is obviously much more to say. So to know more, actually, I highly recommend reading Chiara's articles, including the one she mentioned in her presentation, which was published in the Central Asian Affairs, in the journal Central Asian Affairs, EU efforts to prevent violent extremism by engaging civil society in Kyrgyzstan. She also published in Central Asian Survey, European Union, civil society, and local ownership in Kyrgyzstan, analyzing patterns of adaptation, reinterpretation, and contestation in the prevention of violent extremism. So thank you again so much, Chiara, for your presentation, for the discussion. I would also like to thank our audience for being with us today and for the many questions. And we look forward to having you again in our Central Asia program seminar. So thank you so much. Have a good day, or a good afternoon, or a good night. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Take care. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.